Good afternoon. Welcome to Brown Bag History for March 5th, 2025. Today we're marking the 115th anniversary of the 1910 Rogers Pass Avalanche of March 4th. And as we start, we acknowledge that the land around Revelstoke and on the Columbia River and its tributaries is the Sinixt homeland and traditional territory. We acknowledge the ties of the Secwepemc, the Okanagan Nation Alliance, and the Ktunaxa to this land. We acknowledge our use and habitation of this land, sacred to these four nations. We respectfully honor their traditions and culture. So I'm going to start with this photograph that everybody thinks is of the March 4th, 1910 snowslide, but it is not. And we're doing everything we can to let people know that this is not the March 4th, 1910 snowslide. This is a slide that occurred on March 5th, 1910 at Snowshed 14, just a little bit east of the Rogers Pass summit. But this photo appears in Wikipedia. I've seen it in books. I've seen it in other exhibits. And so my mission and the mission of John Woods, who's been the chief researcher on this project on the 1910 snowslide, we've made it our mission to let people know that that is not the right photograph. And so the photograph, so this photograph was taken by Byron Harmon, a photographer from Banff. And he was commissioned by the CPR to come out and photograph the site of the 1910, the March 4th slide. But there were other slides that were occurring as well, including this one that occurred on March 5th. So he took photographs of all of the slides, and this one, because it's in that collection, often got mistaken. And John Woods came to the museum quite a few years ago now, probably close to 20 years ago, and let me know that that was the wrong photograph. And we went through every photograph, avalanche photograph we had, and made sure that they were all properly captioned, that we knew sort of which was which. So when you see this one out there, you can, if it's on a Facebook post, you can comment and say, that's the wrong photograph. It's a dramatic photograph, so it does often get used. So starting with that, the other thing that we've had to deal with over the years is the number of people who died. So the headline of the Revelstoke Mail Herald on March 5th, 1910, awful avalanche of death, it had 75 men killed. That was sort of just an initial, a bit an exaggeration without really knowing the actual number at that time. But there's a lot of sources that cite 62 as the number of men who died. And that also is incorrect. And we've done extensive research on all of the available material. And we've determined that the actual number of deaths was 58. And I can show you the proof if you need it. But, that's going through the actual CPR records, which we have. It's going through the death certificates and all of the lists. So it was 58. There were a few bodies that were recovered later. So I think in some cases, those 4 additional bodies that were recovered were added to the initial count of 58, but there were 58 men who died. 32 of them were Japanese. They were under a contract by the Nippon Supply Company, which supplied contract labor for sawmills, logging operations, railway work. So they were just sent wherever there were jobs. And we have some of the payroll records from 1910. And so we know how many people, we know that there were very large numbers of Japanese Canadian workers who were working for the railway through the Nippon Supply Company. The bodies of all of the Japanese men were sent to Vancouver, where they were buried in Mountain View Cemetery. And 9 of them, 14 are buried in Revelstoke, 9 in the Protestant section of the cemetery, and there's only 3 markers in place. And then there's 5 buried in the Catholic section with no markers. And those men were all from Ukraine or from areas of Eastern Europe. So what happened is these are from the words of John Anderson, who was the roadmaster for the Canadian Pacific Railway in Rogers Pass. He's on the evening of March 4th, 1910, Anderson had a crew of over 60 men working to clear the rail line at Rogers Pass at the summit. That afternoon, an avalanche had come down the slopes of Cheops Mountain, burying the main line and stopping a passenger train just east of the avalanche. The slide was one of many that came down throughout the Pacific Northwest during a storm cycle that lasted about 10 days. So the men were working alongside a rotary snowplow that cleared a deep trench through the debris. The men were working within the trench with shovels, clearing the snow from the tracks. Just before midnight, Roadmaster John Anderson walked a short distance to make a call to Revelstoke with the message that the line would soon be clear. He came back to discover that a deadly slide had come from the Avalanche Mountain and had from the opposite side of the valley and had buried his crew. He said, this is from a letter that he wrote years later, "I found the rotary pitched on top of the shed. Everything was in darkness and the wind blowing hard, and 58 men buried in the slide. I lost my brother Charlie." His brother Charles Anderson was one of the men who died, and he's one of the few that has a marker in the cemetery. John Anderson resigned his position right after this event, but later went back in service with the CPR and eventually moved his family to Victoria. This photo came from his granddaughter, Julie Lawson, who is a children's author and has written a fictional account of this story. I think it's called The Ghost of Avalanche Mountain. So there was a telegram sent at 1:05 a.m. on March 5th to the CPR General Manager Burry in Winnipeg and to the Revelstoke CPR Superintendent T.D. Kilpatrick informing them of the slide. And it said, at 23:30, slide came down west of 17 Shed, where men were working at slide that came down yesterday afternoon, burying engine and rotary and crews and about 100 men in bridge extra and mason gangs. Only known to have escaped so far as Roadmaster J. Anderson and 4 men, including a fireman who has both legs broken. And then he goes on to mention the names of the crew bosses that were involved in there, and also mentioned some of the crew that were missing, including an engineer Phillips, conductor Buckley, and a brakeman who were among the missing. The second page of the telegram did go on to say, "It was just possible some men may have escaped from east end of slide and may show up at Rogers Pass." But that didn't happen. It said, "Wires down at slide. Special train with every available man, including doctors, will leave here shortly for scene of accident. More complete details to you when obtainable." So in the early hours of March 5th, the word of the tragedy reached Revelstoke. All the steam whistles in the CPR shops and roundhouse rang out simultaneously. At the same time, the fire bell at the fire hall behind City Hall began to sound. People rushed to the station in the fire hall to learn the news of the disaster, and over 150 men agreed to head out immediately to begin the rescue effort. The volunteers were joined by CPR work gangs, including a large crew of workers from India. Among those who answered the call were 16-year-old boys, 2 16-year-old boys, Donald Scott Calder and Charles Procunier, who had been returning home from a house party when they heard the summons for help. The 2 boys ran to the station and they managed to get onto one of the trains going up to the site of the accident. But Donald Scott Calder, who wrote reminiscence of the story years later, said, "We had only gone a few miles up Albert Canyon when Mr. Cotterill, at that time the CPR chief dispatcher and acting superintendent, came through the coaches. Mr. Cotterill stopped to look at two schoolboys, lightly clad, and each holding a short-handled shovel. His first question was, 'Where do you lads think you are going?' And the answer from both of us, 'To help dig the men out of the slide.' The next question, 'Do you realize what you are in for?' The answer, 'No.' This was followed by a statement from Mr. Cotterill. 'Lads, the slide is at least a mile deep, and there is a blizzard blowing in the area of Rogers Pass, where it is at least 30 below zero and possibly colder.' And Donald Scott Calder said, 'Needless to say, Charles and I were crestfallen. Clad as we were in party clothes, we would be forced to remain on the train. But Mr. Cotterill said he would see what could be done. But when they arrived, they were given a hearty breakfast at Rogers Pass Station and issued with heavy woolen caps and mitts, heavily lined snow boots, heavy winter trousers, and wool-lined jackets. And they got to the site of the slide. Said, 'Here we met a devastating sight, for the snow mixed with pieces of timber, shredded like matchwood, was packed almost as hard as solid ice. Heavy picks rather than shovels would be needed and were quickly supplied. The whole side of the mountain had been swept clear of timber, no signs of snow sheds anywhere,' said Charles and I, looking into the stern faces of these men trained in the hazardous work in the mountain section of the railway, prepared for what we knew was to be perhaps our first brush with death. One of the men who did survive was Bill LaChance. He was a fireman on the helper engine attached to the rotary snowplow and was throwing coal into the boiler when the flame burst out. A second later, the snow hit LaChance and carried him out of the engine cab. He said, 'The snow got a hold of me, and what it didn't do to me. Why, it done everything. It pulled me out twice my length, the way it felt, and then it just doubled me all up and rolled me.' After he came to a stop, LaChance was able to dig the snow out from around his face. He dug himself partially out, then realized that his leg was broken. After a long time in the snow, he was finally rescued. Although not expected to survive the night, LaChance recovered and continued to work for the CPR. A man named Duncan McCrae also survived, as he was on the edge of the slide and was thrown on top of snowshed 17. And we had a lot of research done when we were doing the commemoration in 2010. And one of our key researchers was Tomoaki Fujimura, a Japanese Canadian who jumped in and did a lot of research on the Japanese men who died. And through reading some Japanese language newspapers of the day, he was able to determine that there were probably at least 3 other Japanese workers who were partially buried and rescued. And that was information that we didn't have prior to that time. So this picture was taken a few days after the incident when they were still continuing to clear out. And you can see the engine down there and the tender. So I think I'd had that previously set up as just to run on its own. But this was one of the roadmasters who was in charge of the cleanup was a man named Joseph Dame. And this photograph actually shows his wife and children at the accident site, looking over the accident. And you can see that number of men still working to dig out the equipment and still to continue to look for bodies. It was mentioned of that Duncan McCrae had been thrown on top of snow shed 17. There was a snow shed at that location, but a second summer track had been built that bypassed the snow shed. And the shed was meant to be used during the winter months, but no slide had come down at that location for several years. So the winter track with the shed was not being used. So when in Revelstoke said fire bells and engine bells rang in the city soon after midnight on March 5th, and the town responded immediately with men rushing to the station to find out what had happened and how they could help. The newspaper said the response was noble on the part of all who were called, and in a short space of time, a large number of men with shovels assembled at the depot with medical men, druggists, and others, when a train was quickly made up and dispatched to the scene of the disaster. And there were also about 100 men from Golden who also responded and came. Over the next few days, there was probably up to 1,500 men working at the site of the accident. The victims were recovered over the next several days and even a couple of cases in a couple of weeks afterwards. They reflected Canada's cultural mosaic. There were men who had been born in Canada. There were the 32 Japanese men. There were men from England, Ireland, Scotland, Sweden, Denmark, and Ukraine. Some had lived in Canada for generations, and some were more recent immigrants. There was a variety. There were laborers who were just there to dig. There were also the engine crew, bridgemen, and foremen together. The youngest who died was 19, and the oldest was 48. And of course, all of them left family behind. When we did the commemoration project, we created a profile on each of the men, and we have that available too for anybody who wants to see that. So we know at least a little bit about all of the men who died, how old they were, where they were from, who their family was in some cases. The 32 Japanese victims, as I mentioned, were all in the employ of the Canadian Nippon Supply Company. The majority of them had come to Canada in 1907 in search of work. Some had left all their family back in Japan, while others had relatives in Vancouver. The March 15th edition of the Revelstoke Mail Herald expressed a feeling of shock felt by the community. Men who were known locally and who were alive but a few hours ago and engaged in their calling in the CPR service are now lying cold in death, their lives snuffed out at a moment's notice. The awful calamity that has thrown Revelstoke into a state of consternation is the worst in the history of this division and is appalling in its details and the suddenness of the utter annihilation of strong men engaged in the duty of their calling. And it was the largest avalanche event in Canadian history and remains that. One of the other things that I've read in the newspapers and other accounts is that when they were recovering the bodies, because a lot of them had been down in the trench digging out from the trenches, the snow had come right on top of them and buried them, and they said they were finding people just as they'd been standing. They're holding shovels, and in one case they found some men huddled together. So there was absolutely, the men who were in the trench had absolutely no chance of escape.
Ask you to go back to the photo of the scene of the accident. I'm just wondering if you are able to tell us what equipment we're looking at, and then I can only make out the engine in the bottom right corner.
This is a rotary snowplow. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not the best person. You can see that the front of the engine here, and I think the tender, and I can't really tell exactly what that is from here. You need somebody with a bit more expertise in actual railway equipment to answer those questions. So there were 2 coroners juries held. The first one was held on March 11th with the local men, and the newspaper reported all of the evidence that the jury was reviewing, and it said the coroner, in summing up, said the disaster seemed like an accident, pointing out that evidence showed a slide had not been known there for many years. It was no more dangerous working there that night than any other part of the road. The number of foremen killed showed it was unexpected. There's apparently no rule compelling men to work at night, except an unwritten custom among the men. The jury retired, and after about an hour or so of discussion, they failed to come to an agreement over their verdict. So the jury was dismissed as being a hung jury, and a new jury was impaneled. And they met on March 14th, and they returned a verdict of accidental death. And this verdict, which is here, says the said James Moffat. So they took one name to refer to in the jury. So they used the name James Moffat, who was one of the 58 men. That the same James Moffat and others came to their death accidentally on duty as members of the CPR snow service crew at a point on the main line division south of Shed 17, said shed being about 1 mile west of Rogers Pass Station, from injuries received and suffocation caused by a snowslide descending from the northerly slope of Mount Avalanche. We recommend that the CPR withdraw their workmen from service at all slides during stormy nights. So that was the only recommendation made, was that they don't work men on snowy nights. The first jury was hung because I think some of the jury members wanted to find the CPR culpable for the deaths, and they couldn't come to a decision about that. So the second jury assigned absolutely no blame to the railway company. We have several hundred pages of documents relating to this event in our archives. And it includes letters from family members and letters from the CPR superintendent, Thomas Kilpatrick, to the family members. So this was a letter that was sent from the superintendent, Thomas Kilpatrick, to Mrs. Anne Moffat in Belfast, Ireland, regarding her son, James, who was one of the men who died. Said, your son was employed as a laborer on a mason gang, which was clearing a snowslide at Rogers Pass on the 4th, along with about 70 others, when another slide came down and killed 58 men. We were able to recover the remains of all a few days after, and the citizens of Revelstoke are arranging a public burial for the remains of those who have no relatives here. And James' body will be laid to rest on Friday 1st in the cemetery at this point. I shall endeavor to get you a photograph of the burying ground. I am returning to you a few letters which came to him here and which I took the liberty of opening to get your address. I wish to extend to you my heartfelt sympathy at your sad bereavement, and anything I can do for you in this connection, I shall be only too happy to perform it if it is in my power. Yours truly, Thomas Kilpatrick, Superintendent. And then we have a reply from Mrs. Moffat. Said, thanks for your letter of sympathy with regards to the sad fate that befalled my dear son James, so far away from me, but glad his remains were got and buried. And then in the second letter, she said, we will be very glad of the money as soon as you are prepared to send it to me. So we had some wages owing. And as my son James will be a great loss to me, for he was a good son and sent me money regular every month. He would not have left his home, only he could not get any work here. He went out there and endangered his life to earn money to send me, as he knew I wanted it. Also, he knew I worked hard to raise him with a delicate father and can't get work either that he can do. And I'm not able to work now as my heart is broke about my dear son cut away just in the bud of manhood, away where I will never see his grave. But I hope he is in heaven, and God, I hope, will provide for me and his 3 little sisters and 1 brother. So really heart-wrenching letters, and this is just one of several. And they weren't, families weren't given any compensation, but they were sent wages owed. We also have letters from the family of Ralph Hughes. This is from Hugh Hughes, who was the brother of Ralph, one of the men who died. And because Hugh was working here as well, and his family was in North Wales, they asked for permission for him to take the body back to North Wales. So that was done. That was the only case where a body was sent out of the country. But because the brother was here and could accompany the body, they allowed that to happen. And this is a letter thanking them for that. And this is a memorial card that they published or had printed. In loving memory of my dear son, Ralph W. Hughes, died at Rogers Pass, British Columbia, midnight, March 4th, 1910, while on duty. Buried at Penmachno Churchyard, April 2nd, 1910. And there's a lot of other personal material in the archives as well. There's also this very interesting letter that was written by a man named Mehar Singh, who was the crew boss regarding treatment of his crew. And he signs himself Mehar Singh, Hindu boss. And all of the men from India were referred to as Hindus, regardless of whether they were Hindus or not. Mehar Singh would have likely have been Sikh. But there were quite a few of his crew that were working on the event. And he wrote to the superintendent, Kilpatrick, protesting the way that his men were being treated by the roadmaster in charge of the recovery. He said that his men were upset by the avalanche and felt that they wanted to do what they could to help, even though they knew that the work would be difficult and that it would be very cold and dangerous. And Mehar Singh says, "We never frightened and been working all the time in the slides in such dangerous places where a man would never work for $5 a day. And we've been working hardly, whether it was day or night, whether we were hungry or thirsty, thinking that it was bad time on the company and it was bad time on us too." And he said that other crews had refused to come to Rogers Pass and for fear of more avalanches. But despite offers of work, other work, his crew wanted to stay and help. Singh claimed that their car and blankets were at Glacier and they were at Rogers Pass, where they spent 6 nights in the engine shed without blankets. He also claimed that the roadmaster was hitting, shoving, and kicking his men. He said, "All the men are tired of such treatment. He gives us too much trouble, abuse us all the time. We do not like to be abused, even for $100. We've been working here in this country since 2-3 years. We never saw such treatment by the roadmaster towards the boys." He was asking for his crew to be transferred to Vancouver, but there's no reply in the archives, so we don't know whether there was what the response was to the letter. And so the days following the tragic slide were somber ones in the city of Revelstoke, as funeral after funeral was held, including a public funeral on March 18th. And this is showing a procession down 2nd Street. This building here is City Hall. And this houses the current location of the credit union. So they would have, there's a lodge procession, so they would have been leading the procession to the cemetery. There was a memorial service held on March 20th, 1910 in the Opera House, which is on the corner of the 2nd Street corner on the property where the old high school building is. It's now the old school eatery. And it was had approximately 900 people in attendance. There were several of the local clergymen gave talks and prayers, and the combined church choirs did several songs, hymns, and Mayor J.H. Hamilton, who is also the local doctor, said that it was fitting that they should show how keenly they felt that loss and how much their sympathy went out to the bereaved family and friends. And this is the other side of the memorial service. And I can see it has a list of all of the men who died, but it separated the Caucasian men from the Japanese men. It did list all of the names, but there's that separation nonetheless. And list of all of the hymns and the addresses by the local people and the ministers. So this is one of the only 3 markers that's in the cemetery. It's a grave of George Nichols. And next to him, there's several blank uh, spots where I think about 4 other men who died at the Avalanche are buried next to him. But for some reason, only this one had markers. And we don't know whether the others had markers at some point and the markers were either vandalized or degraded. We're not really sure. But the as part of the commemoration, the Mountain View Cemetery in Vancouver created crane markers with a picture of an origami crane for all of the 1910 victims in the Vancouver Cemetery. And they also made an additional 14 markers. I've got a copy of one here that we were able to place on the graves of the other men who died. We haven't been able to put markers with their names yet, but they are marked with the crane markers. And this was a funeral that was held in Golden of 2 of the men, Fritz Wellender and Axel Johnson. And we actually have a photograph of them showing the open coffins, but I don't show that one publicly. As I mentioned, all of the Japanese victims were sent to Vancouver, where Buddhist services were held by Bishop Sasaki prior to burial in Mountain View Cemetery. So this is a picture showing the procession and of the Japanese mourners who were following. This one appears to be probably 2 burials because they were sent in groups. So as they were found, so sometimes there'd be more than 1 burial on one day. And this is actually the ceremony, the burial ceremony at the Mountain View Cemetery in Vancouver. So as I mentioned, when we did the commemoration in 2010, the Mountain View Cemetery did really amazing job of commemorating the victims. They planted some cherry trees, and they had the markers made and a ceremony there as well. So it was really good that they were able to do that. There were some of the few of the Caucasian men who were also buried in Vancouver if they had because they had family in the Vancouver area. This is a picture of Masatora Abe, and those 2 pictures previously were of his funeral plus one of the other men. He was born in Japan February 5th, 1885, and was 25 years old at the time of his death. He went to school in Japan and learned English. So when he came to Canada in the spring of 1907 on the Empress of India, and he worked as a bookman for the Canadian Nippon Supply Company. That means he was sort of a record keeper. He was keeping track of the men and their pay. And so those jobs were given to men who could read and write English as well. He'd previously worked on a gang stationed at Glacier. And on March 4th, 1910, he was working under foreman Victor Carlson. He was single and the 3rd son in his family. His body was found on March 21st and arrived in Vancouver the following day. And we know this because of the work of Tomoaki Fujimura, who did a tremendous amount of research on the Japanese workers and actually traveled to Japan looking for family members and was able to meet with the Abe family. And they were able to provide the photographs that none of us had seen previously. So 100 years later, on March 4th, 2010, we had a commemoration in Grizzly Plaza. Were any of you there that night? Yeah. Got a picture of your daughter with the cranes. But one of the things that Yuko Fujimura and Tomo did was to involve a lot of local people, school children, people in the long-term care units, the military who were based at Rogers Pass, tons of people in the community to make cranes. Because of the Japanese legend that if you make 1,000 cranes, you can make a wish or a hope. And the cranes are really associated with the victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as well. But we used the cranes as a way to really commemorate the Japanese victims who hadn't really been thought about too much in the history of that event over the years, and as a way to involve people and let them feel that they could be a part of that. So there were more than 10,000 paper cranes that were made, and they had been stored on the wall in the Parks Canada office upstairs. And on the afternoon of March 4th, 2010, the members of the Yamaji family from Japan, who were relatives of one of the victims, dressed in their kimonos, led a procession of several of us carrying these cranes we all had our hands on part of the string and carried it up to Mackenzie Avenue and down to Grizzly Plaza where they were hung across the street. I've been at the museum for 42 years. I would say without a doubt that this is the event that has meant the most to me, that I've found the most moving and the most meaningful, just in terms of really recognizing the people that died and sharing their stories and finding out who they were and really honoring them. So it was a really significant event in the community. And there were probably about 800 people or so gathered in Grizzly Plaza. Remember, this was March 4th, so it was a winter's night, cold, and it was just very, very meaningful, as well as the cranes strung across the street. There were 58 white cranes inside the gazebo representing the 58 men, and each one of them had the name on it. A lot of this, there were a lot of people and organizations involved in this commemoration, including Canadian Pacific Railway, the Railway Museum, Parks Canada, Friends of Mount Revelstoke and Glacier, our museum, and so it was really a community event. One of the key people in that was Rob Buchanan, whose artistic vision really shows up in how things looked that night. And one of the things, when you go back to that service in 1910, it was, even though, they had Buddhist services in Vancouver, but there was no real recognition of the beliefs and faith of the Japanese men in that service. So at the service we did in 2010, we had Bishop Fujikawa here to do a Buddhist ceremony as well. We also had Reverend Ken Jones from the United Church doing a prayer, and the choir, the church or community choir, sang the same songs that were sung at the 1910 service. So we made sure that everybody was recognized and everybody's faiths and beliefs were recognized at that. This family here, this is the Yamaji family from Japan, and they'd actually come to Japan a couple of times previous to that. I was contacted by a man from Kamloops who had been contacted by the Japanese embassy and wanting to have the family come to Revelstoke and find out where their great uncle had died. And so we'd actually hosted them a couple of times previous to that. And then they came for the event on March 4th. And Mr. Yamaji gave a talk that evening as well. This picture here there with Karen Tierney, who was the Mount Revelstoke and Glacier National Park superintendent at the time. This photograph down here is Julie Lawson, who I mentioned is the granddaughter of John Anderson, the roadmaster. And this is Mr. Yamaji. And so Julie's great uncle, Charles Anderson, died at the event. And Mr. Yamaji's great uncle, I think it was Manosuke Yamaji, died at the event. And we asked them to read out the names of the men who died. And Julie read all of the Caucasian names. Mr. Yamaji read all of the Japanese names. And in one of those little coincidences that were happening in that whole event, the very first name that Julie read was her great uncle, Charles Anderson. And the very last name that Mr. Yamaji read was his great uncle, Manosuke Yamaji. It was not something that was planned. It was just, but it was one of the many moments that evening where I just felt chills in my whole body. It was extremely moving. And as I say, 800 people were there. Those, children, men, women from Revelstoke who were really touched by that story, and they wanted to be a part of it and honor that as well. The Parks Canada also arranged for the military who were stationed at Rogers Pass to bring a howitzer into town on the CPR Hill, and they actually did a blast of the howitzer as well as a recognition that they were there now working in Rogers Pass to keep people safe from avalanches. So very, very moving event. It continued in the summer. On August 15th, there was a ceremony at Rogers Pass when they opened the memory garden at the Rogers Pass summit. And there was again a ceremony with the Buddhist elements and Christian elements, and the songwriters Saskia Delarond and her husband Daryl Delarond performed a song that Saskia had written years previously called the Ballad of Billy LaChance. And so there was a lot of elements of there. So this was the opening of the memory garden, and these are actually family members of Masatora Abe, who I mentioned earlier. And they came from Japan. And I believe it's the man on the left was a great nephew who read a poem about his great uncle who had died. So again, very moving ceremony. And then that evening, we gathered at the boat launch in Centennial Park and launched these boats. This is referred to as a Toro Nagashi ceremony, or floating lanterns. And it's a way to sort of honor the spirits of people who have died. So each of those lanterns, and I have one here, each of them had the name of the person on it and a candle inside. And they were let off at the boat launch and let to go around just around the corner where they were then picked up. But again, extremely moving. This one, I just really felt like we'd really honored the men who had died, and that we were, had acknowledged them and sort of set them free in a way, or made sure that their memories were treasured by us here in the community. So I'd mentioned that this was part of Superstorm, and on our museum's website, we have, or if you go to our website under collections, you'll see Land of Thundering Snow. And if you click on that link, it'll take you to the website that we created through the Digital Museums Canada 10 years ago. And that website has, one of the things it has is a fatalities map showing all of the fatalities in Canada going back to the 1700s. But it's also has this superstorm of 1910 and talks about how the storm evolved over a period of 10 days throughout the Pacific Northwest. And on March 1st, 1910, was an even larger fatality event than this one in Stevens Pass, Washington, near Wellington, where an avalanche hit buildings and stranded passenger trains on the Great Northern Railway. And 98 people died in that event. A lot of them just passengers on the trains. So over a 10-day period, a total of 180 fatalities happened in Canada and the northwestern US. And this work, this was really thanks to John Woods, who put a tremendous amount of work in researching all of this data and making sure that it was told sort of in the context of that bigger superstorm. And then also on that part of the superstorm of 1910, on day 9, which was the March 4th event, if you click on that Learn More, it'll take you to a video of the commemoration and some of the photographs of that commemoration as well. And the website is landofthunderingsnow.ca. If you need to remember, we have some little QR codes in the exhibit downstairs. And this is part of on the fatalities map. So it shows all of the fatalities that have happened in Canada going back to 1782 in Nain, Labrador. And so there was 995 fatalities in 517 incidents up to March 4th, 2010. And John Woods has continued to collect the data and add it to the website. So from the last 15 years since we did the commemoration, there's been a further 162 fatalities in 123 incidents. And as you can see, the majority of them are centered in this area, with a few in Quebec and Newfoundland, Labrador. But also the color is significant because we've coded all of the recreation accidents with purple dots. And you can see that there's only 2 dots there that aren't purple. So there was one, a mining incident, and then this other color was unclassified, so we don't know exactly, sort of how it happened or what to classify it under. But definitely significant when you look at the early, if you go into the map and check by year, you can see that the majority of the incidents were related to just housing or location or transportation or industry. And now they're almost entirely recreation incidents. But as I say, John continues to keep the map up to date. So if you go on there, you can see it doesn't mention names, but it mentions the locations and the number of people who died. We've also done a lot to make the material available. So our archivist a couple of years ago, Harumi Sakiyama, she digitized a lot of our CPR accident reports, including the 1910 material. So if you go on our website, revelstokemuseum.ca, under collections and down to digital resources, and then on that page, you'll see a little button, click Browse here. And that will take you to our page on the BC Regional Digitized History site, which is maintained by UBC Okanagan. And there's lots on there. There's oral histories, there's high school yearbooks, there's a lot of our photograph collections, but there's also the accident reports, CPR accident reports. And if you click on that, it'll take the first page. You can see where I've highlighted Fatalities, Rogers Pass Avalanche, March 4th. So if you click on that, it will take you to this site where you can read the 682 pages of documents. And those are some of the ones that I showed you today, the letters, the telegrams. Some of it, gets into not as interesting as we go on. It's, people needed to be repaid for shovels and things like that, but it's all there. So if you wanted to go down a huge rabbit hole, there it is. So this has been, really a significant research that we've done, and in conjunction with other researchers like John and Tomo, and that's really provided us with a really important look at this really significant incident in our history of our region. Next Brown Bag History Talk is on March 19th, and it's on Revelstoke in 1900. So what we were like 125 years ago. So thank you for coming today.